Article 1168 of the Civil Code of the Philippines is one of the most important provisions that govern the performance of obligation. It sets out the legal principles that guide the parties' rights and obligations in relation to their contract. In this article, we will provide an in-depth explanation of Article 1168, its interpretation, and its implication. Article 1168 reads as follows. Article 1168. When the obligations consist in not doing, and the obligor does what has been forbidden him, it shall also be undone at his expense. Moreover, the creditor may have the act done at the obligor's expense, and in either case the damage. This is the essence of the complete text of Article 1168. Now let us throw light on these provisions by breaking it down into smaller components and analyzing each of them in detail. First, concept of obligation. The first phrase of Article 1168 starts with the concept of obligation. An obligation is a legal relationship that exists between two parties whereby one party, or the obligor, commits to performing a specific act or refraining from doing something to the other party. The party to whom the obligations own is known as the creditor, and the one who owes is the debtor or obligor. Obligations may arise from a variety of sources, including contracts, quasi-contracts, and torts. And the second is the obligation of not doing. This second phrases of Article 1168 focuses on a specific type of obligation, an obligation to not do something. This type of obligation is usually called an obligation of abstention. It's an obligation in which one party promises not to do something that is forbidden by law or agreement. And the third is the consequences of violating an obligation. The fundamental principles of Article 1168 asserts that when the obligation consists of not doing, and the obligor does what has been forbidden him, it shall also be undone at his expense. In simple terms, if a person has an obligation not to do something, and he or she does something that is contrary to or in violation of the obligation, that person must undo what they have done at their expense. For instance, if a person has an obligation not to build any structures within a specific property or property B, and they go ahead and build structures within that area, they must demolish the structures or bear the cost of demolition. Fourth is remedies available to the creditor. The next part of Article 1168 deals with the creditor's remedies. It states that the creditor may have the act done of the obligor's expense. This means that if the obligor violates the obligations of not doing, and the creditor believes that the restoration of the previous state is not feasible, they may demand that the violator performs further actions to satisfy the creditor. The creditor may then demand the obligor to work to restore the status of co-ante, and with all the related expense deposited of the obligor. For example, suppose an obligor has an obligation not to harvest the crop from his or her land until the first week of March in each year. However, the obligor goes ahead and harvests the crop in the last week of February. In such a circumstances, the creditor in this case might demand that the obligor replants the crops of his or her expense sustained due to the early harvesting. Further, Article 1168 states that in either case, the damages can also be charged against the obligor. This means that the creditor may claim compensations for any damages suffered as a result of the obligor's violations. In other words, the obligor not only bears the expenses of the restorations, but also the damages that result from his or her failure. And then number 5 is burden of proof. This burden of proof is the responsibility of providing one's versions of the event or facts. This is because every assertions made by the parties in the court must be supported by concrete proof to be upheld. In Article 1168, the burden of proof lies with the creditor to prove that the obligor has violated the obligation of not doing. The creditor must show evidence that the prohibition laid out in the agreement were violated by the obligor. Number 6 is limitations and obligation of not doing. It is also essential to understand the limitations and the obligation of not doing. An obligation of not doing can only restrict the debtor's actions within the boundaries of his or her legal capacity. Thus, the law prohibits the imposition of restrictions that could potentially restrain the debtor in the pursuit of his or her professions of hinder him or her from upholding his or her contractual obligation. Another limitation is the ambiguity of the obligation. If the obligation of not doing is ambiguous, it is not enforceable. This is due to the difficulty of determining whether the obligation has been violated or not.